Hello, I'm Karen Hangartner, and I'm the Project Director for the Southern Regional Children's Advocacy Center, which is a project of the National Children's Advocacy Center. We are excited to bring this video series about secondary traumatic stress to you. In this video series, we have conversations with three of the foremost experts in secondary traumatic stress. And in these, we discuss how do these effects show up on individuals, and how does working in the field of secondary traumatic stress impact organizations, and then how do we conduct supervision in a way that's supportive for our staff. And then we'll also hear from Chris Newland, the Executive Director of the National Children's Advocacy Center, to talk a little bit about the role that the senior leader plays in addressing secondary traumatic stress in the organization. And how do we go about creating healthy, supportive environments that support the staff that we're working with. In this video, we're going to have a conversation with Brian Miller. Brian Miller is a psychotherapist who has been working in high trauma exposed environments and providing supervision for staff in those environments for more than 30 years. He's going to talk about the role that supervision plays in supporting staff as they navigate the impacts of secondary traumatic stress. I'm sure you're going to enjoy this conversation with Brian. At what point in your career did you begin to understand how trauma exposure impacts child abuse professionals?
There are two threads that I've followed over my career, and the first one began actually in a study I did more than 15 years ago about what are the career-sustaining behaviors of long-term psychotherapists. And I put this in terms of the resiliency part of the formula around secondary trauma. And that was such a rich experience to me, because after identifying a peer nomination process where psychotherapists would nominate who they believed were passionately committed to the field, and then talking to individuals who have been doing it for 20, 30, and even more years, and trying to cull what the distinctive characteristics of those individuals are. Then as I began doing consulting in child welfare and started to get requests for, we really need support with our own trauma exposure, and starting to find out what is and isn't there within the field, and some of the deficiencies, I think, that within this field as it's emerged, for some really good concrete skills about how do we deal with this. So it became about what are the career sustaining behaviors on the one hand, and what are the perils of doing this kind of trauma work, and how do we best inoculate ourselves against that. There is not a clear way from the empirical evidence to demonstrate whether secondary trauma can be prevented or not. I'm just one reporter's opinion saying I believe that it can be mitigated, if not guarded against, or by the fact that secondary trauma, just like trauma, is caused by two things, and that is not just the intensity of the situation, but feeling helpless and overwhelmed by that intensity. And if we as supervisors can provide the skills, both the craft skills of dealing with that situation, as well as the emotional management skills of how do you deal with the effect on you, I believe that secondary trauma can be prevented or certainly mitigated.
What is secondary trauma?
I think it's important when we talk about secondary traumatic stress that we look at the full continuum of what that means. And the beginning of that continuum is just normal stress response that is in response to exposure to a trauma or a trauma story or a trauma image. So it ranges from just that, the normal stress reaction, and extends all the way to the clinical range, at which point it actually becomes diagnosable PTSD. And so it's the full range of stress responses that are in relation to a trauma exposure. Everyone who does trauma work will have some secondary traumatic stress, sometimes very temporary and very minor, sometimes to the extent that it may actually indicate the need for clinical treatment.
What are some characteristics or some practices that people who work in these high trauma exposed environments need to have in place in order to do this work sustainably?
I think that when you use the word characteristics that help them be resilient, that begins to answer the question. That I think that is what you're looking for in the selection process. And the way I think about it is that what I really came to look for more than anything else, any way you can get at this kind of lean-in energy. Trauma-serving work is intense, and that what you are looking for is the ability to flourish in view of that kind of intensity. And I would even go a step further, and that is that it is a hunger for the intensity and a willingness to lean into that rather than trying to get away from it when it starts to get to be too intense. And that even includes that we know really from more than 25 years of burnout research that what predicts burnout more than any other characteristic is avoidant behavior. People who early in their careers avoid things that cause them distress or unpleasant feelings, those are the individuals that will burn out. I mean, it really was a misnomer to think of that as burnout, because the people who burn out are the ones that were never on fire in the first place. And so I think in the interview, that's what you're looking at, are those people who have that. It is hard to suss out in a particular interview questions, or a specific interview question, but I think because it really is almost a vibration, and that I think people who don't flourish in trauma-serving agencies are those who like the idea of doing this work. They like the idea of people, but in fact, they don't really enjoy and hunger the connection with the full catastrophe, to use Kabat-Zinn's term, the full catastrophe of the work. So I really think that's what you're trying to get at, whatever questions you use. And I know I really like in the interview process coming to understand what is the personal connection this person has to the work. And I think that there must be some kind of personal connection. It can't be that it's interesting. It's got to be that it's deeply personal to them in whatever way. And of course, they need to be allowed to tell that story, but obviously, we're not trying in an interview process to get them to be too personal. But I want to sense that this work is different than if you were interviewing to be a FedEx driver. This work is I think, qualitatively different, and it should feel that way, and it must feel personal if they're going to sustain in the work.
Should you ask about someone's personal trauma history in the hiring interview?
I think that's an important question, because as I consult with trauma-serving organizations, that comes up a lot. About we know that that the incidence of adverse childhood events in workers is neatly double that of the general population in the first place. We don't have to work in the field very long to know that plays an impact in, frankly, the best employees we have. That's what makes it personal to them. That idea that only the wounded healer heals. And at the same time, many of the performance issues that supervisors are working with also come from the fact that there's unresolved trauma in that worker that's being triggered or activated by the work. And so both of those are true at the same time. And so the question about do we ask about it, we know that it's relevant, but everything about secondary trauma-informed supervision is going to require that we're very clear about our boundaries. And that is an inappropriate boundary for a supervisor to ask or make inquiries about anything that's that deeply personal. Working in this field does not give me the right to require that you come forward with that. And one of the absolute bedrock principles of trauma-informed work is about personal control. You, as the worker, have the right to decide whether you're going to disclose that or not. And so that leaves us on the horns of a dilemma. That on the one hand, every supervisor knows how terribly important this is, but on the other hand, it's not really mine to ask. So by working to an answer to that, you start with the fact that no, that's not a good boundary for you as a supervisor to ask about my history of personal trauma. But a good example of a reasonable question within the boundaries of good supervision is a question like, does this case push any buttons for you? And you can decide at what level you're going to respond to that. But my focus needs to be on the client and your ability to serve that client. That's why supervision exists, although it's supportive supervision and secondary trauma-informed supervision, I think, is particularly supportive, but it's all in the service of the best care to the client.
How would you define secondary trauma-informed supervision?
I think that it's an emerging definition as the field becomes more informed about trauma and trauma issues, and then about secondary trauma as it affects the workers, and then about the support that we really are emerging into understanding that trauma-informed and secondary trauma-informed supervision to me are one and the same. And the most distinctive characteristic of secondary trauma-informed supervision is that it is about paying conscious oversight to the effect that the trauma work is having upon the worker. It is that the supervisor and the worker both have an implicit, if not explicit, agreement that we're going to be watching, because we know that doing this kind of trauma work will affect you. And therefore, we will conscientiously pay attention to that. I will be inviting you as the worker to do that. And as your supervisor, I'm going to participate in supporting you with that as well. So it really has to do with the oversight. Then really to do good secondary trauma-informed supervision, it really requires that as a supervisor, I know what I'm looking for, and I know in what ways to support the worker with their trauma exposure. Francoise talks about the three big areas with secondary trauma that have to do with the physical, the psychological, and the behavioral effects that trauma exposure have. Those also become the thing that as a supervisor and you as a worker need to be monitoring and self-assessing. In behavioral health, we talk about the most important thing is any marked change. That's what I as a supervisor will be watching for when there has been some marked change in any of those three areas, and I observe that. But I think, the most fundamental here is just the organizational cultural factor that we acknowledge distress, that we as a team acknowledge when we are experiencing distress, which in most trauma-serving agencies, there is this culture that if you ask me how I'm doing, and if there was a particularly rough case that I just dealt with and you say, how are you doing? Most organizations, the cultural norm is I'm going to say, I'm fine. And there will not be any genuine or sincere self-reflection about how am I doing. And so we need to, as Rumi said, make occasional visits to ourselves. And in this work, we need to be doing that, and we need to have a culture and a supervisor that is continuously encouraging us to make those visits to ourselves about how we're doing. And we need to have a culture where it's normalized for me to say, I'm hurting. I am hurting. That was a difficult case, and it's rocked me a bit.
Do you have to be a clinician or have a mental health background in order to provide secondary trauma-informed supervision?
I'm so glad for that question about whether a non-clinician can do trauma-informed supervision, because the answer first and right out of the box is absolutely yes. That in the psychotherapy fields, we have a long tradition going back to Freud of doing supervision, doing clinical supervision. But in the first place, trauma-informed supervision is not clinical supervision. And in the second place, for those from the helping professions that are licensed in the clinical arts, we didn't get trained in this kind of supervision either. It was a different kind of supervision. And so in that way, you could even argue that it's almost a disadvantage because it's harder to hold your boundary if you're a clinician doing this kind of supervision, because it might be easier for it to become therapy. And so for non-clinicians to start from a position realizing that's not what this enterprise is about. It's not about doing psychotherapy. And I'm not your therapist, I'm your supervisor. And so the kinds of things that I'm going to be doing to support you with your trauma exposure and your secondary trauma are not clinical skills. Again, it has to do with this oversight. And I am two things. One is that I am the chief source of support to you in this organization as it relates to your trauma exposure, and I'm your supervisor. And again, ultimately, even though this is a supportive process, it is about you giving best care to your client.
How often should trauma-informed supervision happen?
I think a careful answer to that question needs to start with the fact that there are no standardized guidelines to that. But what there is certainly broad consensus about is that the frequency of supervision should match the level of experience of the individual worker. Meaning that you would expect that it's going to be more frequent early in one's career and less frequent later in one's career. I personally believe that nobody develops to a point where they outgrow the need for supervision. I think some commonly practiced frequency schedules are that certainly within the first year, if not first 3 years of one's career, that supervision is weekly, and that even for journeyman workers well into their career, that they get at least a monthly opportunity for that kind of support. And the character of the supervision may change depending on whether this is a newly hired worker, where there's a lot more emphasis on the craft skills of how do you do this. With a journeyman worker in their 20th year, it may have to do more with giving them an opportunity to talk about the work, both the pitfalls and the successes of their work. But to continue to exhibit some conscious oversight about their well-being and how is this work affecting you.
How do you help your staff become aware of what their triggers are in the course of doing this work?
Again, everything about secondary trauma supervision parallels trauma-informed care. And that starts with the fact that this really is about giving the autonomy and the responsibility to the worker. And so it really is the worker. So my role as a supervisor largely is to ask the very questions to the worker that you've asked of me. And that is about when your buttons are pushed by this, when you are experiencing distress because of a client's circumstance or client behavior, what does that look like for you? How is that experienced by you? And my role is, number one, to ask the question, and number two, as a supervisor, to have a friendly interest in their current circumstance. It is to be able to communicate that I care about what your current circumstance is, but it is not always to know the answer to that question.
What should a supervisor do when a staff member is exhibiting signs of behavioral, emotional, or cognitive responses to trauma?
Trauma-informed supervision, just like all supervision, again, exists primarily for the benefit of the client. That we have built these supervisory processes in to support the employee, yes, but the reason for that is so that they can better serve their clientele. And therefore, when I like the language of the Americans with Disability Act about reasonable accommodation, because I think that allows this kind of in-between space where the accommodations that we do have to be reasonable, but they also are supportive in the sense that we're willing to accommodate for any difficulties that you're having. And so I think within that language and that construct, if we've got an employee that's struggling, the first question is, are there accommodations that we can make that will support you here? The focus is they have to be reasonable. They may not be accommodations that I as a supervisor am able or willing to make. The job has to be done. A reasonable accommodation is not that you stop serving clients. But again, in keeping with the idea of the autonomy of the individual worker, I really want, in a sincere way, for them to answer the question about what accommodations they need. That being said, again, these clients need to be served, and at some point this may advance to where it's a fitness for duty question. And one of the things that I can do that's both supportive but also keeps an eye on their fitness for duty is about referring for therapy or through the employee assistance program. We're willing to do what we can do to facilitate your well-being, but ultimately there is a job that has to be done, and there are clients that need to be served.
How do you feel about using individual assessments like the Professional Quality of Life Scale and the Secondary Traumatic Stress Scale in the course of supervision?
I think both of the ones that you identify are excellent choices, because what they become, I just think that we do best in any role when we have specific targets, and humans are just built to do target setting. And I think the real value of those instruments is to know what our targets are. Is it about actually mitigating serious secondary traumatic stress symptoms, or is it just about increasing the compassion satisfaction of that individual? And I think for me as a supervisor to have an eye on that with you as an individual worker, but also for my team to have some sense of where my team is collectively. But what I think is very important is that it's not just my information as a supervisor, but that you know your own score and that you establish your own targets. And then I'm in a position of how can I help you? How can I help you with that target, and where is the most support indicated?
When using those individual assessments, should staff be required to share their assessment scores with their supervisor?
I believe that never. For one thing, those instruments are such that if there was any need to appear good, it would be very easy to do so. And so I think the only value of those instruments is the individual's own sincere interest in wanting to know what their score is. And so this has to be done in the sense of goodwill, and we can't have arm twisting and have that result in anything good, I think.
What role does supervision play as people move along the secondary traumatic stress continuum?
It plays the single most profound role of any organizational factor. And I think that becomes a burden and an opportunity for supervisors. And I say that because the evidence is clear that the single biggest reason people leave employment in the human services is because they're dissatisfied with their supervision. The single biggest reason that people stay in jobs that stay for a long period of time is that they value the supervision that they receive. And so it really puts the supervisor absolutely front and center at the most important thing an organization can do in ameliorating the effects of secondary traumatic stress.
Where do supervisors go to get the training that they need to provide this reflective, supportive supervision?
That's a difficult question to handle because they're really, I want to give what I believe is the best answer to that question, and that is the work that's been done by the National Child Traumatic Stress Network in defining the 10 core competencies of trauma-informed supervision. And I think that that's the best that is out there, and that's been produced by the fact that there isn't much out there because this is a new field. The importance of supervision has long been noted in the clinical fields especially, and is becoming of growing importance now to other helping professions. And so this is something that we in many ways are growing together. I think the fact that it is a new field, it really brings to the fore the importance of peer supervision and us coming together in groups of supervisors as we negotiate this terrain.
Where do supervisors go to get the support they need for their own well-being?
I think it's a good question in two ways. First is it's important to take a moment to consider the fact that the supervisors themselves may need support, and that depending on where they are in that supervision hierarchy, they may be getting that from their own supervisor. But absolutely, far and away, my preferred answer to that question is by organizations setting up peer supervision. For instance, a once a month coming together of the supervisors in which they can discuss the cases, and especially the difficult cases that they've worked with.
How does supervision change when someone is going through a personal crisis?
I think this question again raises the importance of being clear about a supervisor's boundaries. And boundaries, of course, are defined by what it keeps out and also what it allows in. And I think in the case of a supervisor dealing with an employee that's dealing with their own personal crisis, what that boundary should allow in a supervisor relationship is concern and regard for their worker. And in that way, of course, it's okay for them to pay attention to the personal crisis of that individual and the well-being of that individual. That being said, again, the function of supervision is not really about the well-being of that individual and resolving their personal crisis. It's about client care, and client care always has to remain in the front of this whole relationship and this whole discussion. And so part of that interest in their well-being is just about asking those questions about how you're doing. But also, if this is a situation that rises to the level, it's about making appropriate referrals through the EAP program or whatever exists in that organization, and it is not about allowing our supervision time to be swamped by what's happening on the personal front, because frankly, we've got work that must be attended to.
What should supervision look like after a really difficult case?
I think in those cases where there's a sentinel event, I value the opportunity to talk about it because for many years in our field, critical incident stress debriefing was our go-to. And as far back as 2002, so it has been a while since we have really done meta-analysis of the effectiveness of that strategy and found that the use of that does not diminish the stress impact on your workers. And furthermore, that the Cochrane Collaborative found that it could be injurious to some individuals. And so in answering the question about what we should do, I think it's significant to look at why critical incident stress debriefing is not the intervention of choice, and specifically that it's believed that some of the damaging effects of doing this is that you are essentially re-traumatizing your worker by asking them to form a narrative when they are still, frankly, in the middle of a trauma. And that, as Margaret Atwood said, in the middle of this event, it's not a story at all. It's just a wreck and a burning. And it takes a while after the trauma before we can formulate that narrative. And so the supervisor isn't doing, in some cases, their worker any favors to force them to tell that narrative before they really have metabolized the fact that this trauma has happened to them at all. And so what do we do instead? I think in the immediate moment, a better analogy is around the evidence-based approach of psychological first aid. And that really is about giving some education to the worker about here's the things you need to be watching for in yourself. And I want you to tell me if you're having problems sleeping, if you're having problems with intrusive thoughts, if you are finding yourself on edge and are not recovering from this. I want to know that. And to really use that kind of educational and inoculative approach and being available when they are ready to talk, but that's on their timeline and not on the supervisor's.
How do you differentiate when you're trying to figure out whether it's secondary stress reactions that are impacting the quality of work or it's just poor quality work?
It may be a distinction that isn't within the province of the supervisor to make. I think the supervisor's role is about making the assessment. Again, supervision exists for the benefit of the client, to assure that client is receiving optimal intervention. And in that, the reason why I think really is a negotiation between the supervisor and the worker about what they need, what's getting in the way. But I think it doesn't alter the fact, for instance, if this client is not receiving assertive enough or effective enough treatment because the worker is having their own trauma response. Then it doesn't change the fact that consumer is still entitled to absolutely the best care that can be delivered. us being supportive of our worker doesn't remove that fact. And so then it becomes an issue still of that worker's fitness for duty. What accommodations or supports do they need in order to provide that? But we've got to keep primary in this discussion the fact that the client's receiving the best intervention possible.
What do you do when you discover that somebody's not fit for duty?
So I think in supervision, and it's certainly true in trauma-informed supervision, we're always trying to negotiate this sweet spot. And the sweet spot is between accountability and support. And I think it's noteworthy that trauma-informed supervision doesn't mean that we have reduced the accountabilities. We have not. But rather we have increased the level of support so that ideally those two are in balance. And what that means is that if this client isn't being served in the best way possible, that must be resolved regardless of whether the source of that is trauma behaviors from the worker or whether it's from sheer inability to do that. We start from a position of trust for that worker, and that we're going to begin from believing that worker wants the best for their clients and they want to do a good job as well. And then I'm going to allow them that level of trust and confidence for as long as I believe that it's warranted. At some point, when I believe that there is negligence, either gross negligence or simple negligence of just not being willing or able to do the job, then I think we have now moved into an area when we talk about the dual roles of supervision. There is the accountability role and there is the support role. And at some point, again, we always put the client first. Their well-being has to come first. And at that point, I may move into really more of an accountability role as a supervisor, which really means I begin the process of progressive discipline, which is really just about, and progressive discipline can be as positive or as negative as we mutually allow it to be, but it is about a clear explication of the expectations as it relates to that client. It also includes what supports we're willing to bring in to assure a good faith effort for your success as a worker. And then as any of those expectations are not met, then we move to the next step in that disciplinary chain that I believe really must extend all the way to counseling that person out of this profession.
For agencies and organizations that are doing supervision well, what specifically are they doing?
Supervisors that are getting trauma-informed supervision right are doing it with intentionality. They begin from a place of what is it that I want to accomplish, and presumably what they want to accomplish is supporting the well-being of my worker. And so starting with that intentionality and then building into their supervision predictability, a routine where you as my supervisee knows exactly when we're going to meet, that meeting is prioritized, which means if a conflict comes up for you or for me, that we reschedule it because that's my way of signaling to you that this is important to me. That there is a regular agenda for when we do meet, and that agenda is going to include, I use the rule of thumb of approximately 1/3 of our time is going to be dedicated to just talking about your well-being and the effect that the work's having on you.
What are the top 3 things that you would recommend for people in this work to maintain their wellness?
And I'm going to respond to that since my topic's about supervisors, about what the supervisor is coaching in the worker. And I think that those top 3 things, one is that it must be about managing let me put it this way, conscious inquiries about worker distress must be intentional. The supervisor must go in and have an intention to ask the worker about their level of distress, or else we unwittingly are going to set up a culture where it's not okay to talk about your distress. So it really begins from the supervisor asking. And so number one that I'll suggest on that list is about asking the worker if they are troubled in their evenings about any of the cases that they've worked with that day. And that includes asking them about whether thoughts are intruding or about whether they're sleeping well at night or actually even losing sleep because of the cases that they work with. And that allows allows for the supervisor to begin talking about some strategies about managing the ruminations that may occur during the evening. I think that also that oftentimes the supervisor must be the one to initiate a discussion after a difficult case encounter in order to facilitate that worker developing a narrative about what happened to them and what impact that has had on them. I think a question that I really like is for the supervisor to ask, how do you feel like you handled that? Because it's really a no-lose question, because the worker then is able to say, I did okay. And that consolidates their competence around that situation. Or they can say, I blew it, I think. I think I was too reactive, at which time the supervisor can say, how would you handle that differently next time? Which I think paves a way for this narrative of advancing competency over these difficult situations. And then ultimately, I think there must be, the third will be about a continual discussion about the level of compassion that the workers are experiencing towards their clients. And it's with an understanding that they always have an ideal of constant compassion for all of my clients, and none of us get there. There are difficult clients that have difficult behaviors, and that this needs to be talked about openly in terms of the fact that what makes you a virtuous person is your commitment to be compassionate, but that doesn't mean that you are compassionate 100% of the time, and that many of the difficulties, a lot of our emotional energy goes to the fact that we are straining to get to that compassion. And it really helps to have a supervisor where these discussions can be had forthrightly.
Can you talk a little bit about the hazmat metaphor that a lot of people use when talking about responding to secondary traumatic stress?
Well, I'd love to talk about that, because I think that hazmat metaphor can take us the wrong direction. And I understand some people talk about it just in terms of it being a skill set to manage difficult emotions. But I worry that it suggests this idea that we have to buffer ourselves from these intense experiences. Whereas in reality, everything we know from trauma work to just exposure and work with anxiety disorders is that avoiding those kinds of situations, and specifically avoiding the feelings that are created in those situations is actually a recipe for burnout and anxiety. And so I think instead of that hazmat suit, I think we really need to think in terms of taking our gloves off and really leaning into those intense experiences and just getting better at feeling whatever comes up, whether that's anger, whether that's fear, whether that is grief, and to trust that those feelings will be metabolized rather than trying to avoid them and minimize them when they happen. And again, the supervisor, I think, plays a key role in normalizing that and allowing that.
Oftentimes we hear about professionals really ruminating or spinning on cases outside of the office. What are some strategies that you've seen work for professionals?
What I coach staff to do when they find themselves doing that is that the rumination really is it's a cognitive event. It's not about the emotions of that experience, but rather that we're conjuring that image in our brain. And when we conjure that in our brain, we get that fight or flight, that feeling of being stirred up, which means we conjure more, which means our limbic system gets more aroused, and now we're in this looping. And so what I coach workers to do is to break that for as little as 2 minutes by moving away from the rumination into any activity which is focused external to the self. In other words, an absorbing activity. To engage in some absorbing activity for really just as little as a couple of minutes to break that looping that we do when we're in rumination. It's also particularly helpful to get out of our own head and engage somebody else in a conversation. Can be really effective at minimizing those ruminations. When they're middle of the night ruminations, the 2 a.m. keep me awake. I can break that rumination cycle just by planning an action plan in my mind about what action needs to be taken as it relates to whatever is causing me to ruminate, and to make that action plan very specific and very concrete. And that can be effective at quieting those ruminations down.
Can you give some examples of an absorbing activity?
So I think anything that's absorbing to you from, again, a conversation with another person is top of my list. Reading a particularly absorbing story, physical activity, hobbies. I think anything that you can move to rather effortlessly that holds your attention, because key here is to move from the default mode into task positive mode, and that means that we need something so that we're not thinking about ourselves and stoking that rumination process up again.
If I'm not a clinician and this isn't my comfort zone, how do I start this conversation with other professionals and teams?
I think it's a good practice for agencies to have secondary traumatic stress a feature of every meeting that we do. That's one thing that will normalize it, and that it doesn't, in fact, shouldn't sound clinical in content. It really is about how is everybody doing. And it's about, at first, individuals who are willing to be vulnerable, and then hopefully the cultural norm developing that everybody is free to talk about the fact that they, that they may be struggling with any particular case or at any particular moment. But I think the best way to normalize it is absolutely get it into the water and make it part of a meeting, just like you would read the minutes, to do a quick check-in with people that can be very informal, and just who out there is needing some support from us as a team.
Talk about grace and goosebumps.
That's something that I've done, I think, with great effect on teams that I've worked with, where in the meeting I just make a call out for any stories of grace and goosebumps. And the moments of grace are those moments when you're working with a difficult case. Perhaps your hope was low about whether this was going to be effective, and then something happened that just created this sense of grace where everything shifted. And the moments of goosebumps are really just stories where we have these encounters that remind us, oh yeah, that's why I wanted to do this. And I think the beauty of institutionalizing that storytelling is that it for everybody, it's a coming back to the personal mission that I'm on as I do this work. And that hopefully it extends beyond the meeting when you're telling those stories, and it actually becomes part of your daily habit where I start noticing these. Because otherwise, if we don't savor them and pull them out and tell the narrative, they'll escape our notice and be lost.